The colony ship Meridian had been drifting for 11 days before Sergeant Elias Voss stopped believing in luck. He'd believed in it once. Most humans did, early in the war, this low, persistent faith that the galaxy would eventually balance its own ledger, that the Cathara wouldn't keep winning simply because they were smarter, older, more numerous, and had been crossing star systems while humanity was still arguing about which side of the river to build on. 11 days adrift in a dead ship, surviving on recycled water and emergency ration blocks that tasted like compressed sawdust, had a way of curing that kind of optimism. Elias had used the time productively. He'd reread every field manual stored in his helmet's HUD. He'd cataloged every functional component still aboard. He'd also written, by hand, in a small paper notebook he kept in his left breast pocket, old habit from before the war, when he'd spent 3 years trying to get a novel published, approximately 14,000 words of what he privately considered the worst fiction ever produced by a member of the human species. He was adding to it when the Cathara boarding party found him. There were 6 of them. Cathara scouts moved in groups of 6, which their military theorists considered a geometrically perfect unit: 2 to flank, 2 to advance, 2 to observe. The lead scout paused in the doorway of what had once been the Meridian's small commissary, its 4 luminous eyes cycling through the near-infrared spectrum as it processed the lone human sitting at a folding table, writing in a notebook, with an empty cup of recycled water at his elbow. Elias looked up. He set his pen down carefully across the notebook's open spine. "Hey," he said. The scout did not speak. None of them did, for a long moment. The Cathara communicated in layers that humans had only partially decoded: subsonic vibrations in the chest cavity, chemical signals dispersed through the gill slits at the jaw, and a secondary language conveyed entirely through the deliberate positioning of the lower 2 arms. Their vocal speech, when they chose to use it, came out in translated standard through the implanted devices the Galactic Compact had mandated they wear during all encounters with client species. It sounded like someone speaking through a pool of cold water. "Human," the lead scout said, "you are designated prisoner of the Ascendancy. You will submit to binding." Elias looked around the ruined commissary. He looked at the 6 armed scouts. He looked at his notebook. "Sure," he said. "Can I finish this sentence first?" The prisoner transport was a Cathara mid-range vessel called, in standard translation, the Immovable Will. It was enormous by human standards, segmented like a nautilus shell, and kept at a temperature that the Cathara found comfortable, but that made every human aboard feel as though they'd been asked to function inside a refrigerator. Elias was given a cell that was, by any objective measure, adequate. The dimensions were wrong for a human body: too narrow at the shoulder, too low at the ceiling, but there was a sleeping platform, a waste receptacle, and a slot in the wall through which nutrition paste was delivered twice per cycle. He had his notebook. They'd taken everything else. He spent the first week writing. The guards found this interesting. Cathara scouts were not, as a rule, assigned to monitor individual prisoners. That was automated work, handled by the ship's sensory web, but Elias noticed the same 2 recurring at the observation window of his cell with a frequency that exceeded what surveillance protocols required. They would stand there for 10, 15 minutes at a stretch, watching him write. Once, he held up the notebook and showed them a page. One of the guards made a sound low in its chest, not quite a word, more like a pressure releasing, and moved away. The other one stayed. Its name, as best Elias could approximate, was something like Serath of the 4th Breath Colony. He started calling it 4. 4 did not object, or if it did, the objection didn't translate. It was younger than the other guard. He'd learned to read relative age in the muted shimmer of the scale patches at the temple, and it carried its weapons with the slightly over-deliberate care of someone who'd been taught precisely how to hold a weapon, but hadn't yet forgotten that they were holding one. "What is the purpose of the marks?" Four asked him, 10 days in. Its standard was better than it should have been, which meant it had been studying. "I'm writing a story," Elias said. "A story," Four processed this. "A sequential false account for pleasure transfer." "That's a hell of a definition, but yeah, basically." "What is the account of?" Elias considered. "A man who made a deal with someone he shouldn't have." "And what that cost him?" Four's lower arms shifted, the Kethara equivalent, he'd come to understand, of a thoughtful frown. "Is the account resolved?" "Not yet," Elias said. "I'm working on the ending." He had been working on endings his whole life. Before the war, he had been a writer, or trying to be one. 11 years of that. 11 years of novels and short stories and 2 ill-advised screenplays sent out into the world and coming back, every single time, with the same gentle and devastating vocabulary. "Not right for us at this time. Doesn't fit our current list. We wish you every success with your future endeavors." His friend Marcus, who wrote thrillers with body counts in the double digits and a new one out every 18 months, had found success so easily it had started to feel like a personal insult. Elias had taken the rejection letters home and reread them the way a medieval scholar might study a difficult text, looking for the secret message, the specific thing wrong with his work that, if fixed, would change everything. He hadn't found it, he'd enlisted instead. Not out of patriotism, or not only out of patriotism. The war had been going badly, and the draft was coming, and Elias had decided that if he was going to be placed in harm's way for a cause he didn't choose, he would at least have some marginal control over which particular harm and which particular way. He turned out to be good at soldiering in the way that surprised both him and his commanding officers. Not aggressive, not fearless, but methodical, patient, capable of sitting very still for a very long time in an uncomfortable situation and thinking his way toward the option that wasn't obvious. He thought about this often, in the cell on the immovable will. He thought about Marcus, who had been stationed on a defense platform above Europa and was almost certainly dead. He thought about his flat in Edinburgh, the bay window that leaked, the particular way the light fell across his desk at 4 in the afternoon in November. He thought about every story he'd never finished. He wrote them down, all of them, or as many as he could fit in the remaining pages of the notebook. Not the stories as he'd planned them, those plans had always been the problem. The over-engineered architecture of someone who thought a story was a problem to be solved, but the emotional core of each one, the thing underneath, the reason he'd wanted to write it in the first place. It was, he thought, the best work he'd ever done, which was convenient given that no one would ever read it. The immovable will arrived at its destination 3 weeks after capturing Elias. The destination was the Kethara home system, the first human to see it alive, which was a distinction he would have appreciated more if it weren't immediately followed by being transferred to a facility that translated, with uncomfortable accuracy, as the Hall of Reckoning. The hall was not a prison. That was the first thing that confused him. It was a court. The Kethara legal system was, as far as the Galactic Compact had been able to determine, among the oldest continuously operating institutions in the known galaxy. They had been conducting trials for longer than humanity had been using metal. Their jurisprudence was elaborate, formal, and governed by a set of principles that the Compact's translators had spent decades trying to render into standard without losing anything essential. The closest approximation was something like, all debts exist, all debts end, all endings must be witnessed. What debt he was accused of owing was not immediately made clear. He was assigned a place at a long stone table. The stone was not stone. It was something like compressed biological material that the Kethara grew rather than quarried, but it felt like stone under his hands, and told to wait for the arbiter. The arbiter, when she arrived, was not what he expected. She was old. That much was clear even to human eyes. The scale patches had faded to a near-uniform silver-white. The lower arms moved with a deliberateness that spoke of long practice rather than youth. But what struck Elias, sitting at the stone table with his notebook in front of him, was the quality of her attention. She looked at him the way he imagined a surgeon looked at a particularly complex problem. Not with malice, not with warmth, but with a complete and disciplined focus that excluded everything except what was relevant. Her name translated as Kethra Voronathiel. She was introduced to him as the first voice of the Hall of Reckoning. She was, he would later learn, the oldest living Kethara and the highest legal authority in the Ascendancy, equivalent to, though not quite analogous with, a Supreme Court justice with the power to end wars. She sat across from him and looked at his notebook. "You write," she said. Her standard was perfect. Ancient but perfect, the kind learned from original texts rather than conversion software. "I try," Elias said. "The guards on the transport vessel submitted a request to be assigned to your cell permanently," she said. "This has not happened before. Kethara sentinels do not request proximity to human prisoners." Elias said nothing. "One of them, the younger, transcribed what could be seen of your written marks through the observation window, and submitted the transcription to the hall as evidence." Elias considered this. Evidence of what? Anathiel's lower arms moved in a configuration he hadn't seen before. "That is precisely the question before this court," she said. The case, as it was explained to him over the following 3 days, was this. The Kethara Ascendancy had captured a human prisoner in possession of a text. The text, as far as the hall's analysts could determine from partial observation, appeared to be a work of narrative fiction. Narrative fiction was, under Galactic Compact law, classified as a Form 7 cultural artifact, material of potential cross-species significance, to be assessed for preservation rather than destruction. The question before the court was whether the text qualified for Form 7 protection, and whether, if it did, its author had any legal standing as a cultural producer under articles governing protected persons. In other words, if his writing was good enough, they had to keep him alive. If it wasn't, they didn't. Elias sat with this for a long moment. "I'd like to read it to you," he said finally, "if that's part of the process." Anathiel looked at him. Something moved in the 4 luminous eyes, a shift in the light spectrum that he associated by now with the Kethara equivalent of surprise, though whether it was good surprise or bad surprise he couldn't tell. "It is not standard procedure," she said. "I know," Elias said, "but it's a story about a man who made a bad deal and then had to argue his way out of it in front of a judge. I think it might be relevant." The lower arms moved again. This time he was almost certain it was amusement. "You have 12 hours, she said. "At the end of 12 hours, the court will render a decision." He didn't sleep. He sat at the stone table in the preparation room they'd given him and read through everything he'd written over the past month, the way you read a manuscript you haven't looked at in a long time, searching for the through line, the emotional spine, the thing that made it more than the sum of its parts. He crossed out sections. He rearranged the order of 3 sequences in the middle section. He added a paragraph near the end that he'd been resisting writing, because it was too personal and he was, by instinct, suspicious of personal things. Then he thought about all the rejection letters, the gentle, devastating vocabulary, not right for us at this time. He picked up the pen and added 2 more paragraphs. At dawn, the facility had windows, tall, narrow strips of something transparent that looked out on a sky that was the wrong shade of blue, too teal, shot through with bioluminescent atmospheric particles that the Kethara breathed like oxygen. He closed the notebook and held it with both hands. He thought about Marcus, who had been his best friend and his literary nemesis, and the person he trusted most in the world, who had written books that sold and who had died on a defense platform above Europa, and who had deserved better than either the war or Elias' complicated feelings about his success had given him. He thought about the way Marcus had read every draft Elias ever wrote and said, every single time, "The bones are good. Fix the heart and you've got something." He thought the bones are good, fix the heart. He opened the notebook to the first page and began. He read for 4 hours. The Hall of Reckoning could seat, at full formal assembly, approximately 400 Cathara. On the second day of his case, there had been perhaps 40 present legal functionaries, translators, observers from various compact member species, the requisite guards. When he entered the chamber on the morning of the third day, there were over 300. He did not ask how they had heard. He walked to the reading position, a raised platform designed for Cathara speakers, which put him at the wrong height for his body but would have to do, and he opened the notebook. He read the opening. A man in a ruined apartment throwing his typewriter out the window, watching it fall, not knowing that the act of destruction was the beginning of something rather than the end. He read the second section, the beautiful stranger at the door, the impossible offer, the moment of decision made with the particular recklessness of someone who has stopped believing they have anything left to lose. He read the part where everything the man had wanted arrived all at once, in a wave he couldn't control, and how it turned out that getting what you wanted was its own kind of ruin. Not because the things were bad, but because in getting them, you had to become the version of yourself that deserved them, and that version wasn't someone he recognized. He read the part about the friend. This was the paragraph he'd added at dawn. It was about Marcus, though he'd changed the name and the job and the specific circumstances of the death. It was about the feeling of watching someone you love succeed where you had failed, and the specific shame of realizing that the feeling was envy, not admiration, and the way that shame sat in you like a stone for years until the person was gone, and the shame became grief, and you couldn't separate them anymore, couldn't tell which feeling was which, could only carry the combined weight of both and hope the carrying meant something. He heard something from the assembled Cathara that he'd never heard from them before. A low sound, not quite a vibration, more like a collective pressure change in the room, the sound of a large number of minds encountering something they hadn't expected. He kept reading. The story's end was the trial reshaped, transposed, given different names and a different setting, but recognizable in its bones. A man arguing for his own life in front of a judge who was ancient and fair, and not inclined toward mercy, making the case that he had value not because of what he'd accomplished, but because of what he understood. That loss and shame and love and failure were not disqualifications from personhood, but the proof of it. That the mess of a human life, its inconsistencies, its reversals, its ability to hold grief and hope in the same hand without either canceling the other, was not a flaw in the design. It was the design. He closed the notebook. The chamber was very quiet. He looked up at Anathiel, first voice of the Hall of Reckoning, and he said, "That's the ending. I told you I was still working on it." She did not render judgment immediately. The Hall of Reckoning required deliberation. He was returned to his preparation room and given food, actual food this time, not the nutrition paste, something warm and protein-dense that the facility cook had apparently prepared in consultation with a medical database of human nutritional requirements. He ate it slowly, sitting by the narrow window watching the wrong blue sky change color as the local star descended. The bioluminescent particles brightened as the light faded, turning the atmosphere a deep shifting green. It was beautiful, he thought. Genuinely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with being human or Cathara or on the right or wrong side of a war. Just light and atmosphere and time, doing what they did. 4 appeared at the door of the preparation room. The young guard had been stationed at the hall during the reading, which Elias gathered was unusual. Transport sentinels didn't typically accompany prisoners past the intake procedure. He had requested it, Elias suspected. He wasn't sure whether that was against regulations or not. He suspected 4 had reached a similar uncertainty and decided not to resolve it. "Did you finish?" 4 asked. "The story, yeah." Elias looked at the notebook on the table. "First time I've actually finished something. Feels strange." "You have written before but not finished." "Many times. I always got stuck on the ending." He paused. "I think I was afraid that if I finished it I'd have to find out if it was good." 4's lower arm shifted. "And now?" "Now I don't care if it's good. I know it's true. Those turn out to be different things." 4 was quiet for a moment. Then it said, carefully, "On the transport when you showed the guard the page, the other sentinel." "Yeah." "I was outside the observation range. I did not see the marks. I saw only the change in the other sentinel's posture when they looked." 4's 4 eyes found his. "What did the marks say?" Elias thought back. That had been early in the journey, page 30-something. He had been writing about the apartment in Edinburgh, the bay window that leaked, the light at 4 in the afternoon. "I was writing about a place I missed," he said. "Just that, just a place. The specific way the light came in at a certain time of day." 4's lower arms moved in a slow, deliberate configuration he hadn't seen before. "What does that mean?" Elias asked. "That gesture?" "In our language," 4 said, "it means, I understand something I did not expect to understand." The deliberation lasted 18 hours. Elias slept for most of it, real sleep, the first since the meridian, which said something about the state of his nervous system that he chose not to examine too closely. He dreamed about the apartment, the light, Marcus sitting across the desk from him reading a draft and saying, "The bones are good, fix the heart." He woke to the sound of the preparation room door opening. It was not 4, it was Anathiel herself. This was, apparently, profoundly unusual. First voices of the Hall of Reckoning did not visit preparation rooms. They rendered judgment from the bench, in formal session, with the full chamber assembled. Anathiel stood in the doorway of his preparation room and looked at him with the complete and disciplined focus that excluded everything except what was relevant. "The hall has deliberated," she said. Elias sat up on the sleeping platform. His notebook was on the table. He'd put it there before sleeping, the same way he always put it on the table when he was done for the day, a small ritual, a gesture toward the idea that there would be another day, that it wasn't finished yet. "What did you decide?" he asked. "The text qualifies under Form 7, Anathiel said. "You are designated a protected cultural producer under Articles 17 through 22 of the Compact's standing provisions." She paused. "This means the ascendancy cannot detain you without formal charge, cannot compel labor, and must ensure your physical safety for the duration of any custody." "I'd settle for a ride home," Elias said. Something shifted in Anathiel's expression, not warmth exactly, but its functional equivalent, the opening of a register she didn't typically use. "I have a question," she said. "It is outside the scope of formal proceedings." "Ask." "The figure in the story, the advocate, the one who argues at the trial, you modeled him on someone." Elias looked at the notebook. "On the idea of someone I read about when I was young, a lawyer from the 19th century. He was famous for his oratory, for his ability to make juries remember that the person in front of them was a person. He was human. Very." Anathiel looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then she said, with great deliberateness, "The youngest of the deliberating panel was my granddaughter. She is 18 cycles, which is equivalent to your early adolescence. She has never left the home system. She listened to your reading for the full 4 hours. The lower arms moved. Afterward, she came to me and said, 'I did not know they were like us.'" Elias said nothing. The wrong blue sky outside had shifted to a deep green gold in the early morning light, the bioluminescent particles catching the first angle of the local star. "She said," Anathiel continued, and her voice was very careful, very measured, the voice of someone who had spent a century learning to separate feeling from function and was choosing, deliberately, not to. She said, "The human sadness sounds like sadness." The words landed somewhere central in Ilya's chest. He didn't have a response to that. He didn't think one was required. "I have conveyed to the relevant command structures," Anathiel said, "that this prisoner represents a significant Form 7 case and requires assignment to neutral compact custody pending full cultural assessment. The transport will take you to the compact station at Rhea 7, where you can request repatriation." She paused. "I have also conveyed my opinion, which is not binding but carries some weight in the relevant command structures, that the Ascendancy's assumptions about the human capacity for," she stopped, selected a word, "for interiority have been inadequately examined." Elias picked up the notebook. He held it for a moment, the weight of it, the weeks of writing, the unfinished stories made finally into finished ones, the paragraph about Marcus that he'd added at dawn because he was tired of carrying it alone. Then he set it on the table and pushed it toward her. "I want you to keep it," he said. "Give it to your granddaughter." Anathiel looked at the notebook. "I can write another one," Elias said. "I've been writing my whole life and only just figured out how to actually do it. I've got time." He paused. "Tell her the bones are good. That's all you need. Fix the heart and you've got something." The transport to Rhea 7 took 6 days. Elias spent it sleeping, eating actual food and beginning a new notebook. He'd found a supply of blank ones in the hall's administrative offices, where apparently the Cathara still used physical marks in certain ritual contexts and kept paper products on hand. The paper was slightly wrong, larger grain than what he was used to, a faint blue-gray tint, but it took ink acceptably well. He started with Marcus, not the paragraph he'd written on the eve of the trial, the one about the envy and the grief, which was true but wasn't the whole truth. He started with the first time they'd met, which was a literary workshop in Edinburgh, where Elias had been trying to make the case for the emotional reality of his work, and Marcus had raised his hand and asked a question so precisely aimed at the structural flaw in that case that Elias had spent the next 2 years writing to answer it. He wrote about the years of parallel failure, which in hindsight had not felt parallel at all. His failure had felt total and Marcus's partial, a distinction that had mattered enormously at the time, and that seemed very small now. He wrote about the way Marcus talked about his thrillers, which was with the same combination of affection and mild embarrassment you might use about a dog that had won an award in a category you hadn't expected. He wrote about Europa, about what it meant that Marcus had been there and not somewhere else, and that this had been a matter of assignment rather than choice, the great indifferent machinery of military logistics placing a thriller writer above a frozen moon at the wrong time. He wrote about the feeling of finding out, the 11 seconds between the notification arriving on his HUD and understanding what it said, 11 seconds in which Marcus was still alive in some meaningful sense, still the next message he hadn't written yet. He wrote, "I am not sure that grief has an ending. I think what happens is not that it ends but that it changes shape, from something that occupies all the available space to something you can carry, something you can put down on a table and pick up again. Something you can hand to someone else to hold for a while, if they're willing." He wrote, "I hope you are willing." He wrote that to Marcus, but also to Anathiel's granddaughter, whoever she was, 18 cycles old and taking her first steps toward something she hadn't expected, the understanding that sorrow from a different body felt, in the end, like sorrow. He wrote, "That is enough, that is more than enough, that is everything." The compact station at Rhea 7 was a transfer hub, 43 species, 17 languages audible in the main concourse, a food court that served 17 different nutritional chemistries in a space the size of a football pitch. Elias stood in the repatriation queue for 40 minutes behind a Vorathi couple arguing about luggage and a second researcher, who had apparently been trying to leave the station for 6 days due to a paperwork issue involving a biological sample. He felt, for the first time in months, completely anonymous. It was one of the best feelings of his life. The repatriation officer was a human, a young woman from what he thought might have been the Australian territories, based on the flat vowels in her standard, and she processed his identification with the professional efficiency of someone who had seen stranger things than a Form 7 protected writer arriving from the Cathara home system. She asked him if he'd been mistreated. He said no. She asked him if he had any intelligence material to report. He said possibly, but it was the kind that didn't fit in a standard debriefing form. She raised an eyebrow. He set his new notebook on the counter between them. "This is what I want to report," he said. "When you get to the part about the youngest deliberating panel member, Anathiel's granddaughter, I need you to read it carefully. I think it matters." The officer looked at the notebook. She looked at him. She was probably 25 and had the expression of someone who had not signed up for this particular kind of mourning. "Is this a novel?" she said. "Yes," he said, "but it's also a field report and a letter. And an argument for a position that no one in our military command structure has seriously taken yet." He paused. "It's the kind of thing that's more than one thing at once. That's what I used to be afraid of. Turns out it's actually the most useful kind." She read the first 3 pages standing at the counter. Then she sat down. The Compact's Cultural Division processed his Form 7 case over the following 4 months. He was interviewed 17 times by assessors from 7 different species, which was, they told him, a record for a single artifact case. The notebook, the original one, the one he'd left with Anathiel, was submitted to the Compact's permanent archive at a ceremony. He was not invited to attend but watched via transmission feed from his temporary housing in Geneva. He wrote about that too. The way it felt to watch your work become an artifact while you were still alive to see it. The strange doubling of being both the thing and the person who'd made it, simultaneously valued and beside the point. The second notebook was published 8 months later by a Compact-affiliated press that specialized in cross-species communication texts. It was formatted as a memoir essay hybrid, which Elias hadn't planned but which the press's editor, a Compact veteran and former linguist named Petra Voss, no relation, said was the only form that made sense for something that was doing that many things at once. It was published in Standard first, then translated into 7 other languages including High Cathara, which required the translation team to invent 2 new grammatical constructs to handle concepts that didn't exist in the existing High Cathara vocabulary. The concept of interiority, it turned out, existed in Cathara culture, had existed for longer than human language, but in a form that was, structurally, considered private, a personal possession not meant for sharing. The idea of making one's interior life legible to strangers, of writing it down and handing it to someone you'd never met in a form designed specifically so they could find their way inside, was not absent from Cathara culture. It was considered extraordinarily intimate, almost transgressive, the kind of thing you might do once in a life, in a context of absolute trust. The translation team included a footnote explaining this. Elias read the footnote in Geneva and sat with it for a long time. He thought all those rejection letters, not right for us at this time. He thought, I have been doing the most intimate thing humans do, and sending it to strangers, and then being surprised when strangers found it hard to receive. He thought that makes a certain kind of sense. He picked up his pen and started writing. The war did not end because of a notebook. He never claimed it did, though others did on his behalf, which he found uncomfortable and somewhat amusing. Wars end because of logistics and casualties, and the slow, grinding arithmetic of what's sustainable. and because eventually someone on both sides is tired enough and smart enough to understand that the arithmetic is telling them something they don't want to hear. The Cathara ascendancy and the human systems had been at war for 11 years when the armistice talks began, and the talks took another 2 years and collapsed 3 times and were rebuilt twice before anything was signed. Elias wasn't in the room for any of it. He was, by that point, traveling first with a compact cultural observation team, then alone, notebook in hand, moving through the parts of the negotiation process that weren't held in rooms. He was there when Anathiel testified before the full compact assembly regarding the cultural status of human narrative production. She spoke for 6 hours. He read a transcript afterward. He hadn't been allowed in the chamber, and found, embedded in the middle of the 5th hour, a passage about a human prisoner who had argued his own case from a reading platform designed for a larger body, in a hall full of people who had come expecting nothing and left carrying something they hadn't expected to carry. She described it as the moment the court understood that the question before it was not about law. She said, the question was about what it means to know that something on the other side of the room is alive in the same way you are alive, not similar, not analogous, the same. She said, we did not know. We should have known. The failure of knowing is a debt, and all debts must end, and the ending must be witnessed. He read that and sat with it for a long time in a transit bay on Rhea 7, waiting for a connection, the notebook on his knee and the pen in his hand, and the memory of Anathiel standing in the doorway of his preparation room at dawn, looking at a paper notebook with the expression of someone encountering something they hadn't prepared for. He wrote, there is a particular kind of courage required to revise what you believe. Not bravery. Bravery is for when you are afraid and act anyway. This is something different. This is looking at the shape of your understanding and admitting that the shape is wrong, and then agreeing to sit with wrongness long enough to build something truer. It is harder than bravery. It is slower. It does not feel like victory. It is the thing that makes victory possible. He heard from 4 once before the armistice, a text transmission through compact diplomatic channels, formal and careful in its structure, because 4 had apparently spent a considerable amount of time making sure it was transmitted through appropriate protocols. It said, I have been assigned to the Cultural Assessment Division of the Hall of Reckoning. It is not standard for a transport sentinel to make this transition. The first voice supported the reassignment. I have been given responsibility for the maintenance and access protocols for certain archived materials. I wanted you to know that the maintenance is careful. It said, I have also, in my personal time, which is allocated at 12% of each cycle, begun making marks. It said, I do not know if they are good. I know that they are true. Elias read this transmission 3 times. Then he wrote back, through the same compact channels, and his message was this. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The armistice was signed on a neutral station in the Hellion Reach. Elias was not at the signing. He was on Earth in Edinburgh, standing in front of the bay window of an apartment that was not the one he'd had before the war. That one was gone, the building repurposed during the evacuation years, but which had the same northern exposure, the same quality of light at 4 in the afternoon in November. He stood at the window for a long time. He thought about the notebook that was in a compact archive, and the one that was on the table behind him, and the ones that would come after. He thought about the envy that had become grief, that had become something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, but that felt, when he held it, like a completed sentence. He thought about Marcus, who had been his best friend and his literary nemesis, and who had asked him once, late in a long evening after a 3rd glass of something they shouldn't have been drinking, do you think any of it actually matters? Do you think anyone actually reads it and changes? He hadn't known how to answer then. He thought, yes. I think one person reads it and understands one thing they hadn't understood before, and that person makes one decision differently because of that understanding, and that decision changes the shape of one other person's life. And the chain of that is very long and very slow and almost entirely invisible, and it is enough. It is the work. He thought about Anathiel's granddaughter, 18 cycles old, standing in a hall on the Kethara homeworld and saying, "The human sadness sounds like sadness." He thought, yes, exactly that. He picked up his pen. Outside the window, the light shifted the particular angle of November in Edinburgh, gold and horizontal, falling across the desk and the blank pages of a new notebook and the pen in his hand and the long work ahead. He began. There was a man, he wrote, who had everything to lose, and no particular reason to believe that what he had was worth keeping. He paused. He crossed out the first sentence and wrote another. There was a man who had nothing left but words, and that turned out to be exactly enough. He kept going. Outside, the city was quiet under the early dark, and the light was just the light, and it was enough. It was more than enough. And he wrote until he couldn't see the page anymore, and then he sat in the dark and listened to the city breathe. He thought, the bones are good. Fix the heart. You've got something. The second book was harder to write than the first. He hadn't expected that. He'd believed, after the Hall of Reckoning and the transit to Rhea 7 and the 4 months of cultural assessment interviews, that the difficulty was behind him, that he'd found the thing that unlocked the work, truth over quality, completion over perfection, the heart over the bones, and that knowing it would make the doing of it automatic. He had been wrong about this in the specific way that a person who has had one difficult thing go right believes they've solved difficulty, rather than solved one particular instance of it. The second book was about the war, not the way military histories were about wars, the logistics, the casualty counts, the movements of forces across contested space like pieces on a map, but about what it meant to be inside it as a person, with a body and a past and specific things you missed and specific fears you'd learned to live with in specific moments, multiplied across millions of people, of sitting in a dark place and deciding whether to keep going. He tried to write it 3 times and stopped 3 times. The first version was too distant, the professional filter engaged, the experience held at arm's length, described from the outside. The second version was the opposite, too raw, too interior, the kind of writing that felt honest while you were doing it and incoherent when you read it back, a transcript of a feeling rather than a transmission of it. The third version started well and collapsed in the middle, and he spent 2 weeks staring at the collapse before he understood what was wrong. What was wrong was that he was still trying to protect himself. Not from the reader, from Marcus. Writing about the war meant writing about Marcus fully, not the paragraph at dawn on the eve of the trial, compressed and targeted and serving a specific function in a specific argument, but the actual texture of the friendship, the years of it, the way Marcus ate, which was with a focused velocity that suggested he considered eating an interruption. The specific shorthand they developed for talking about their work that existed outside of language and would not survive either of them. The way Elias could tell from across a room that Marcus had found something in a draft that wasn't working, a slight stillness in the reading posture, a microscopic pause before turning the page. The time Marcus had been in hospital for 3 weeks after an appendix complication, and Elias had visited every day and read him passages from a manuscript he was working on, and Marcus had, from a hospital bed, still managed to identify the structural flaw in the third act, had still said, "The bones are good, fix the heart," and they had both laughed because the joke was that Marcus had no idea he was doing it. He wrote all of it. He wrote Marcus completely, in full dimensionality, without protecting himself from the grief of the fact that the person he was writing would never read what he was writing. He wrote the envy and the love, which he now understood were not opposites. He wrote the years of watching Marcus succeed and the complicated way that had felt, which was not simply bad, it was bad and proud and envious and joyful all at once, the way a sibling might feel watching a sibling win. He wrote Europe, and the defense platform, and the 11 seconds. When he read it back, he found that he'd done something he hadn't done in the paragraph at dawn. He'd written Marcus's voice. Not a description of Marcus's voice. The voice itself, as it lived in memory, the specific rhythms of his speech, the way he constructed a sentence when he was certain of something, the different way he constructed it when he was finding his way towards certainty in real time. It was there in the manuscript, threaded through the sections about the war, and reading it was like being in the same room with someone who was not there. He sat with that for a long time. He thought, this is what narrative does. This is the thing I was always trying to do and always failing at because I was too afraid to do it completely. You put a person in the text and the text holds them. Not forever, paper burns, files corrupt, civilizations end, but for longer than memory. Long enough for a stranger in a different body on a different world to pick it up and find, inside it, something that sounds like sadness, something that sounds like love, something that sounds the same. He finished the second book 14 months after starting it. Last chapter was not about the war. It was about the apartment in Edinburgh, the bay window, the light at 4 in the afternoon, the desk where he'd spent 11 years sending work into the world and getting it back always with the gentle and devastating vocabulary of rejection. He wrote it as a kind of inventory, not a list of what had been lost but of what had been there, the specific quality of the light, the sound of the street below, the way the radiator knocked when the temperature dropped. The stack of rejection letters that he'd kept, for years, in a folder labeled evidence as a private joke, whose meaning had shifted over time. Evidence of failure, evidence of effort, evidence of the fact that he'd kept going when the reasonable response was to stop. He wrote, I don't know why I kept going. I have spent a long time trying to construct a reason that sounds better than the truth, which is that stopping never felt possible in the same way that breathing stops feeling like a choice once you've started. I was a person who wrote. That was the fact of me, the thing around which everything else was arranged. When the writing wasn't working, when the rejections came, when Marcus was succeeding and I was not and the failure felt total and final, I was still a person who wrote. I didn't stop. I couldn't tell you why. I'm not sure I was brave or stubborn or principled in any particular way. I think I simply didn't know how to be anything else. He wrote, that is the thing I read to the Cathara court. Not the plot of the story, the shape of it, the man who made a bad deal, the judge who was ancient and fair, the argument at the end. The plot was a frame. What I read them was that. The fact of continuing when continuing makes no particular sense. The human capacity for persisting in the direction of something you believe without evidence that the believing is warranted. I am not sure that is a virtue. I am not sure it requires a name. I think it is just the condition of being the kind of creature that tells stories, that takes the random material of experience and insists on shaping it into something that has a spine and a heart and a possible ending. He wrote, I have thought a great deal about what Anathiel said to me in the preparation room, about her granddaughter, about the fact that my sadness sounds like sadness. I have thought about what it means that sorrow is legible across species, that the specific vibration of loss translates, that a Cathara adolescent in a hall on her homeworld can hear a human reading about a dead friend and recognize what she is hearing. I used to think that was a miracle. I think now it is just a fact. I think the miracle is that we spent 11 years in a war before anyone thought to test it. He wrote, wars end. Not cleanly, not completely. They leave things behind in bodies and landscapes and the specific way certain words feel in the mouth, years after. But they end. And what comes after the ending is the long work of deciding what the thing meant and whether the meaning can be turned into something other than sorrow. I think that is our work. I think it is the only work that matters. I think it is exactly what stories are for. He put the pen down. Outside, the Edinburgh light was doing the thing it did in November, gold, horizontal, exact. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about the Hall of Reckoning and the bioluminescent sky and 4's transmission, the careful protocol, the 12% of each cycle, the marks that were not known to be good but were known to be true. He picked up the pen. He wrote one more line. He wrote, "You were right, Marcus. The bones were always good. It just took me a while to fix the heart." He closed the notebook. He set it on the table in the particular way he always set it when he was done for the day, the same gesture, the same placement, the small ritual that said, "There will be another day. The work continues. Something waits in the blank pages that isn't blank yet." He sat at the window until the light was gone, and the city lit up below in all its cold northern beauty, and he didn't write anything else that night. He didn't need to. The second book was published the following year. The translation into High Cathara was undertaken by the same team as the first, and they sent him an advance copy in both languages, bound together as a single volume with the standard text on one side and the Cathara on the other, mirror image, meeting in the middle. He sat with the bilingual edition for a long time, moving between languages, reading the standard version of a sentence, and then the Cathara version, watching the meaning travel across the gap, noticing what survived and what transformed in the crossing. The translators had included notes. The word he'd used for the specific quality of grief that contains love had required a phrase in Cathara. There was no single word, but the phrase they'd constructed was, in back translation, something like, "The ache that lives in the space where something beloved was." He thought that was better than his word. He wrote them a note saying so. They wrote back saying the Cathara equivalent of, "You're welcome. We've been waiting for a text that needed this phrase. We had it ready but no occasion to use it." He read that note several times. He thought about it for the rest of the week. He thought about the fact that somewhere in the long history of the Cathara, in the private interior life of a species that considered interiority almost transgressive to share, someone had felt the specific ache that lives in the space where something beloved was, had felt it clearly enough to need a phrase for it, had made a phrase, and held it in the language, waiting for a moment when it would be needed across the gap. He thought, we are not as different as the war required us to believe. He thought, the work of undoing that belief is slow and hard and never done, but it is the only work that matters, and it begins with a sentence. With one person making marks on a surface and another person, somewhere, in a different body on a different world, picking it up and reading. He thought beginning is enough. He picked up the pen. He began. The invitation came in the third year after the armistice. It arrived through compact diplomatic channels, which was the only channel that reliably reached him at that point. He had been moving, and mail had been following him with varying degrees of success. It was from the Hall of Reckoning, official header and seal, and the message inside was brief. It said, "The Hall of Reckoning requests the presence of Elias Voss, Form 7 protected cultural producer, for the purpose of the archive dedication ceremony for the original text, designated case reference HFY 7001. Attendance is voluntary. Travel costs will be assumed by the Ascendancy. The ceremony is scheduled for the spring cycle." Below the formal text, in a different hand, the Cathara equivalent of a handwritten note, a series of marks that the compact translator rendered awkwardly but recognizably, was a short additional message. It said, "My name is Serath of the Seventh Breath Colony. I am the granddaughter of the first voice. I have read your books. The marks you left, the first ones in the notebook, I can tell you that they are good. The bones are good. The heart is completely fixed. I hope you will come. I have been making marks of my own, and I do not know yet if they are worth anything. I thought you might be willing to look." He sat with the invitation for a day and a night. He thought about the transit to Rhea 7 and the wrong blue sky and the bioluminescent particles turning the atmosphere to deep shifting green in the twilight. He thought about the Hall of Reckoning, the stone organic table, the complete and disciplined focus of Anathiel's attention. He thought about 4 and the 12% of each cycle, and the marks that were not known to be good but were known to be true. He thought about being 22 years old with his first finished manuscript in a folder labeled Evidence, mailing it to a publisher in London, with the absolute conviction of someone who has not yet learned the specific vocabulary of rejection. The way that conviction had felt, the particular quality of its texture, not blind optimism exactly, but something older and simpler. The instinct of the creature that tells stories, leaning forward into the blank space, putting marks on surfaces, making the private legible, handing it to a stranger and saying, "Here is the inside of it. Tell me if it sounds familiar." He thought about Seraph of the Seventh Breath Colony, 18 cycles old, or 20 now or 21, old enough to have read 2 books and made marks of her own, marks she didn't know yet if they were worth anything, asking someone to look. He wrote back through the diplomatic channel. The message was short. He wrote, "I will come. Send me a reading list first. I want to know what you've been reading. I want to know the bones of what you're working on before I read it so I can tell you whether the bones are good. The rest we can figure out when I arrive." He sent it and waited. Her reply came 4 days later. It was 43 pages of dense notation in high Cathara script with a translator's summary attached. It contained a list of 17 texts she considered essential, 6 from Cathara tradition, 4 from human literature that she'd read in translation, 3 from Vorathi oral narrative tradition that she thought were relevant to both, and 4 that she had written herself and which she described, in a phrase that the translator rendered with evident uncertainty, as provisional marks towards something not yet named. He read the translator's summary and the list, and then, with a Cathara language module loaded into his HUD that had been growing more comprehensive over the past 3 years, he read the first of her provisional marks in the original. It was about the light. Not Edinburgh light, Cathara homeworld light, the teal gold of a late morning filtered through atmospheric bioluminescence, falling through a narrow window in the hall's administrative wing onto a table where a young woman sat and felt, for the first time, the specific weight of a thing that was hers. The text described this in the careful, deliberate way of someone who has learned to distrust easy emotion and is trying to find language that earns the feeling rather than simply naming it. The bones were extraordinary. He wrote back, "The bones are extraordinary. Fix the heart. You have time. Meet me when I arrive and bring everything you've written and we will sit and work through it and you will finish at least one of them before I leave. That is the agreement. You do not get to send a writer home without making them see at least one thing through to its end." She wrote back, "That is a very human approach to a negotiation." He wrote back, "Yes, it is. Write it down, it might be useful later." She wrote, "I already have." He put the pen down and looked out the window at the Edinburgh street below, the particular cold northern light of a November morning, the way it fell across the desk, the notebook stacked beside the computer, the folder labeled Evidence that he'd kept through everything, through the war and the transit and the hall and the years of travel, that he'd never opened again but never thrown away either. He'd always told himself he kept it because it was a record, a proof of something. He understood now that wasn't quite right. He kept it because it was the beginning. The whole long chain of it started there. The 22-year-old with his first manuscript and his uncorrected conviction, the 11 years of gentle and devastating vocabulary, the day he'd thrown a different manuscript out a window, metaphorically, his typewriter being long since replaced by a computer he could not afford to throw, and enlisted and found out that patience and stubbornness were military assets as much as they were artistic ones. The 11 days adrift on the meridian, the commissary table, the pen and the notebook and the 6 scouts in the doorway. Hey, he'd said. He'd said it with nothing behind it except the fact of being there, the fact of continuing. The peculiar human capacity for sitting in a ruined commissary in a dead ship and writing bad fiction, while an alien boarding party tried to figure out what to make of him. He thought that is the whole story. Everything that came after was the consequence of that, of not stopping, of being, even in extremity, irreducibly the thing he was. He looked at the folder labeled Evidence. He picked it up. He held it. He thought about all the letters inside, the gentle, devastating vocabulary, the same words arranged in slightly different orders like a code he'd spent years trying to crack and had finally understood was not a code at all. It was just people on the other side of a desk, doing their best with what they had, making decisions with the tools available to them. Not malice. Not blindness. Just the ordinary difficulty of knowing from outside what was worth receiving. He thought, I know how that feels now. I sit in that chair too. He set the folder back on the desk. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He picked up the pen and opened the newest notebook to the first blank page. He wrote, Dear Sarath. He wrote, Here is what I know about beginnings. They are the hardest part and also the only part that matters in the way that matters most. Everything after a beginning is consequence and revision, and the long work of making the beginning mean something. But the beginning is the act. The beginning is where you decide, in the full knowledge that you might fail, to say something anyway, to put the mark on the surface, to hand it to a stranger. He wrote, You have already begun. That is everything. He wrote, When I arrive, bring the notebooks, all of them. We will work through them together and I will tell you which bones are good. They are all good, I suspect, because I have read the first one and the instinct in it is real. And we will fix the hearts of them one by one and you will finish them and they will be yours and they will go into the world and come back to you carrying whatever they carry and you will keep going anyway. That is the agreement. That is the whole of it. He wrote, I will see you in the spring. He signed it, Elias. He folded the letter, not because he would mail it by hand. The diplomatic channel was faster and more reliable, but because the folding felt right, felt like the correct gesture for a letter to someone he hadn't met yet, but already knew in the way you know someone whose work you've read, whose interior you've been inside, whose marks on a surface have told you something specific about the shape of their particular life. He thought about all the letters that had come back to him, the gentle and devastating vocabulary, not right for us at this time. He thought maybe they were right, maybe the time was this. Maybe the whole long detour, the 11 years, the war, the meridian, the hall of reckoning, the transit to Rhea 7, was the story finding its correct moment, its correct reader, the one it had been shaped for without knowing it. He thought, that is a very consoling interpretation, and I choose to believe it. He picked up his coat. He had a transport to book. He had a diplomatic channel to send a letter through. He had a spring appointment on a world with a wrong blue sky and bioluminescent atmospheric particles, and a young person waiting with notebooks full of provisional marks towards something not yet named. He had work to do. He had always had work to do. He went out into the Edinburgh morning, the November light cold and horizontal and exact, falling on the street, and the people and the city and everything that had survived, and he was already writing the first sentence of the next thing in his head, the way he always was, the way he always had been, the perpetual low hum of the machine that made him what he was. He was a person who wrote. That was the fact of him. That was enough.